22nd and 23rd verse of Daniel. Daniel makes an accusation. It says, "But you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven." This morning we enter into our fourth week of the study of Daniel. Today's lesson is a little bit different by the fact that we have this realization that we fail to recognize some things in today's culture. That being, there are consequences for our actions. We've seen how Daniel, along with his contemporaries from Judah who have been exiled to Babylon, who have been trained in Babylonian history, wisdom, and lore, have received grace from King Nebuchadnezzar after persecution because of their stern insistence of maintaining their faith in the living God of Abraham, rather than trusting or turning towards the pagan gods of Babylonian beliefs. They have been threatened with death in various ways, and yet their faith has protected them and has served as witnesses to God and led to the revelation of God's power, might, and grace to a king who did all he could to quell this avenue of thought and belief. Last week we saw how the king's pride took him out of authority and into the wilderness, only to realize the truth and the blessings that God had for him and had given to him. And with this acknowledgement, he was restored to his power, to his throne, and to a position of authority throughout his kingdom. Through God's grace and mercy, we see how God has the ability to change hearts from cold and hard to warm and full of love. This week, however, we hear from Daniel another side of God that we often fail to acknowledge in today's church. We rarely talk about the concept that there are consequences if and when we fail to be open to God's covenant with us. Today we read the next chapter of the historical tale of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar is no longer in reign. He has been succeeded by his son Belshazzar. This new king is ready to make his own mark on the kingdom, and still dependent upon his faith in the pagan gods. Belshazzar is determined to show those who have been exiled from Judah to Babylon that their God is nothing more than a pagan god at best. And so he calls for the goblets of gold and silver and all the dishes that were taken from the temple in Jerusalem, and he uses them for this party that he gives with 1,000 people. They drink from them wine. And that probably would not have led to the scene that we read. But when Belshazzar uses them as a tool, as an idol, to honor and praise and worship the idols of bronze, wood, iron, stone, gold, silver, all these idols and gods that he and his ancestors had created and collected, God felt that it was time to draw the line in the sand. Or in this case, draw the line on the wall. A human hand appears and writes a series of lines and figures on the wall that leaves everybody trembling and wondering what is about to happen. I have to ask, have you ever seen a child when they realize that they've done something really wrong? This week, we had family in town. Some of us were sharing some of the wrongs that our kids had done. And one of the stories that we shared was about a couple of the cousins who had gotten into these 2 gallons of paint. And these gallons had pump tops. And they proceeded to squirt paint all over the den. When they heard that Dad was coming, like Belshazzar, they too went white with fear. Their knees began to knock. That's what Belshazzar experiences this morning. All of a sudden, a hand appears on the wall. Our version of the Bible, our translation, says that he turned pale and he was so frightened that his knees knocked and his legs gave way. Nice, but the literal translation depicts it a little clearer. The literal translation is a little more graphic about Belshazzar's fear. It says that the knots of his loins were loosened. He did more than just tremble, maybe faint. He probably, in reality, needed some cleaning when he was done. He realizes at this point that Dad is now in the room. This God that he was trying to minimize is now ticked, angry beyond belief, and the punishment is going to be severe. I would be willing to offer that if he was this afraid, he probably did not need to have the writing on the wall translated. He probably knew what it was going to say. But I would imagine that it would be along the lines of, we meet someone speaking a different language, but we know what the translation is. How does this relate to us today? Is the handwriting on the wall for us? Maybe not for us in particular, but possibly it could be for those in our culture, for many in our culture, and for many in our world. We have been consistently battling those who disavow that there is a God, who's able to change our lives to change our lives to one of love for each other. Or maybe I would propose the opposite. Those disavowing God have been battling our faith. Several years ago, a church put up a billboard on I-95, kind of parroting the Got Milk ads, asking, "No God? You know God?" The Humanistic Society, aka the atheist group, rented a sign with the same picture and the same words, but rather than instead of knowing God, rather than know God, it said,